Good morning, everybody. I'm part of the 1/3 that came from across the pond, the other side. My name is Ross Epstein. I'm the VP of New Projects at SafeGraph. I'm going to take a little bit of a less technical approach than Emily here from the Pets at Home side. We're going to talk a little bit from a basic level of how we think about not just POI data, but really generating some of the inputs that she was taking into some of those models. And how we go ahead and how we think about building those things, but hopefully I'm going to impart a little bit of wisdom to you all for how you guys can do that on your own, or however anybody else can help. Oh, I gotta use this guy. Okay, so by show of hands here, how many folks have either built or maintained at a certain point in their professional careers a POI data set? Okay, I'm glad we got some hands there. We're going to show you a little bit today about how, of course, SafeGraph is fairly opinionated with how we think about POI data sets, but we'd love to impart a little bit of this wisdom here. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about what are the pieces of metadata that we generally think are fairly important when thinking about POI data sets. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about how you and others can go ahead and enrich these POI data sets to really drive business decisions. And finally, we're going to talk through a couple of great use cases that we've seen across all these inputs to drive great outcomes. My assumption here is everybody has historically made what we would consider to be expensive decisions driven from data. And what we're hoping to see today is beyond just POIs being what sometimes can be thought of as fairly what we would consider to be more static data, how we can apply more real-time consumer behavior data on top of this to really drive better decision making. So I know I mentioned that POIs can generally be thought of in sort of this static realm, but holy crap, they are not. It is a moving target. As you think about generally the things around you in the physical world, there's a lot to maintain when it comes to POIs, and I think we've all dealt with not just stale data, but just bad data. So a couple of things that to keep in mind as you guys are building out data sets, things like openings and closings. So what happens when a store closes around you? How do I track these things? How do I make sure that I'm driving and I understand the things that are open, the things that are closed? What happens when certain brands and subsidiaries are acquired and brought into other organizations? Are they renamed? Do we really want to be sending our customers to poorly named stores that may be a different place? What happens when, of course, we were all around in 2020 when open hours were shifted significantly? We don't want to be sending people to the front doors of locations that were closed 3 hours ago. And finally, if we're helping our customers and our users try to go ahead and reach those locations, reach those businesses over phone, I wish everybody kept the same phone number all the time, but that doesn't always happen. So these are all the types of things that we think about when starting to build up these POI data sets. When you think about just that's sort of just the moving targets that we have to focus on. It gets much more challenging when you start to think about sort of broadly what the schemas are that are part of these data sets. So that comes into things like address normalization, so making sure that the addresses that are there are generally clean, they make sense, your address parts are there, and you can do what you need to. Of course, I think we're all here sitting at a spatial data science conference. First and foremost, you got to make sure your points are accurate. Whether you've got rooftop centroids, whether you've got front doors, whether you've got other sorts of access points, those geocodes it's challenging to maintain. And then finally, let's imagine that you brought in all these different types of sources for POIs, and it's now the opportunity to build what you consider to be a source of truth. You don't want to go ahead and you need to make sure that you're not duplicating things, right? If you're sending someone to a particular location and you've got two different points that might be next to each other that represent what might look like to the end user as two different points, you want to make sure that those things are merged together, that we're deduplicated, that we're showing the right single point to those individuals. I know this is I try to mention this one pretty often, but these sorts of POI files and POI data sets it's kind of funny. We just think of them as rows and columns. That's all it is. It's a tabular data set of rows and columns. Rows being the number of places you cover, columns being the number of attributes and metadata about those places. And making sure that you have these things maintained, updated is of course, a very important part to driving these right outcomes. And of course, it's beyond just accuracy. It's both accuracy and precision. So let's make sure we've got a truthful representation of reality, but that we also are repeatedly generating comparable, accurate measurements for each of these pieces of metadata. So now that we've talked a little bit about that, okay, the easy part is just is doing this for every single country in the world. So make sure that you've got great language, great language and context for different sorts of alphabets. Make sure that you understand regional hierarchies. Make sure that in any particular region that you understand what the local chains are, whether there are any particular local brands, and there are any particular names that are used in a particular country that are not what the global brand may be named as. So it starts to get challenging as you layer in all these additional dimensions. But just something to keep in mind. I think we're sitting here in London with quite a few who are working at multinational corporations. It's challenging to work on this, but something to keep in mind. And then finally, from our side, like there's quite a few other pieces of data that we find are challenging to generally collect. But we hope that as you guys are building and trying to build your own POI data sets, that you're applying the right investments and knowing the right place to push, the right place to pull, or sourcing from other places, et cetera. So we've talked a little bit about sort of how we think about broadly POI data. Let's dive into a little bit deeper into sort of, we've talked a little bit about how. We want to talk about a little bit more of the what here. So when we think about POIs, there are sort of like two core pieces to a POI product and to a POI file that, of course, we're all working on that we think are super important. One is just the list of places. We call that our places file. Those are a list of locations. We've historically used the vernacular of where consumers spend money or they spend time, but this is broadly expanding. I know a lot of folks here work on supply chain use cases, so not a lot of people want to be spending so much time in warehousing, but we know it's important and it's required as part of understanding demand planning and supply chain planning, et cetera. And so that's the places file, which is again just a list of these locations. And from more of the spatial side, we like to think of what we consider to be our polygons for these places being geometries. So we know that making decisions isn't just about the points and about the locations, but sometimes it's about their physical representation in the world. So not just square footage, as Emily was alluding to from the stores, but sometimes you need to understand how is this enclosed inside of a mall, right? Who is it co-tenant and who is it next door to? If you have a Starbucks inside of a Target, a Starbucks coffee shop inside of a Target store, how do you understand that there's actually a parent-child relationship between those two locations? Because sometimes it does require a little bit more nuance in some of these decision makings and some additional inputs into whatever your modeling may be. Of course, on the SafeGraph side, we take a fairly opinionated view to different types of points of interest. Of course, some of the bare basics being names and geocodes. But one of the things that we focus on that I think quite a few might be interested in focus on here as well is brand affiliations. So you've got essentially every store and every store location that you might be interested in indexing and understanding, making sure that you have a very clear and clean taxonomy for the types of brands that they're related to, as well as brands and sub-brands. So if there's a Walmart distribution brand that is available, that you're tracking from a supply chain perspective, understanding that those are related to Walmart stores, and understanding that all Walmart distribution centers are a sub-brand to those types of Walmart stores, generally speaking, that helps in driving this decision making. A couple of other good pieces of metadata that we think are good to focus on are things like industry codes and categories. So your standard NAICS classifications, your SIC codes. And of course, the one that is always the moving target is opened on and closed on dates. So how are things changing around and changing around the world around me? On the geometry side, we've got, this isn't just the polygon for these places, so the Royal Geographic Society, not just the outline for this auditorium, but also there was, I believe there was another building over that way. Understanding that there's that parent-child relationship between this auditorium and the broader campus that is the Royal Geographic Society is a fairly important piece to how we think about maintaining and building this geometry product, but we think can be a very interesting piece of input into your modeling and how you think about forecasting and working around. So we've talked a little bit about the schema, we've talked a little bit about how. Now I want you guys to have to, now as you can imagine, there's quite a few use cases across quite a few narrow types of definitions for what the types of rows could be covered within a POI data set. And so just want to flag in the back of your head the types of locations that can sometimes be a little bit stickier when you're trying to think about building these POI data sets. First and foremost is what we consider to be, we call them point POIs, which are points of interest that don't necessarily have a physical footprint. And if they do have a physical footprint, like how would I really interpret what that physical footprint might be? So for example, an ATM. We're not really gonna draw an outline for an ATM at an aerial view. So for an ATM, you've just got a point that represents this is the location of that. For an electric vehicle charging station, same thing. I don't know if anybody, or I hope there's nobody here from Redbox, but I don't know if you guys have used the red boxes where you can put in your credit card and get a DVD as well. Those are great. Those are part of the kiosks that are included. Same things with transit stops. So these are all we consider to be fairly important pieces of inputs into driving great POI products, but these are ones that don't necessarily have polygons. Another one in sort of the industrial category. Right, POIs, of course, and on the retail side, focus pretty heavily around store locations and consumer-focused locations, but there are very strong use cases we've seen in things like commercial insurance, demand forecasting, supply chain analysis that require things well beyond just store locations. And so this is what we would consider to be in our industrials categories. So broad categories for those would be warehousing, data centers, broadly non-consumer POIs. And these are things that are generally, depending on your use case, can be fairly important, but require different sort of sourcing and POI building as you continue to dive in. Now let's imagine that you're trying to figure out the right locations for your stores, but need to understand that, hey, are we making sure that we have enough parking capacity for these places? Are we optimizing our locations based off of parking? This is another form of what we would consider to be a challenging point of interest input, which is polygons for parking lots. So we've seen a great amount of input recently in broadly the connected vehicle space, with people understanding how vehicles are moving around, origin destination trips, being able to attribute those types of trips to actual point of interest locations instead of the Walmart store being over here, but someone actually parks over here, being able to understand that they're actually within the parking lot that's enclosed and part of that Walmart store is pretty important. And so this is a pretty interesting set of POIs that we find ones to be fairly interesting to help with use cases like that. I think I've mentioned this now 3 times on the open and close side, but from a POI side, ensuring that from a metadata perspective, we understand the types of locations that are opening, the types of locations that are closing, when they are opening, when they are closing. This does require a constant amount of sourcing. So as you're building your own sourcing and POI pipelines, just ensure that you're keeping all the metadata in which you're sourcing so that you can go back and build these things over time, even if they're not important right now. I'm sure many of you are familiar with either NAICS codes or SIC codes with regards to classifying of locations and classifying of businesses. But these only really tell one, these only really tell one story. By the way, I think this might be running low on battery. Okay, cool. These only really tell one story about the types of locations that are there. You can only derive so much insight from a NAICS code for a location that says clothing stores, right? Because mainly, maybe if I'm putting in a particular type of location, I'd much rather know that it is a men's clothing store over a female clothing store or a lingerie store or a hats store. It's a little bit less applicable for me, but these require different sort of categorization tags that are a bit more granular than just NAICS classifications today. And of course, I mentioned this again, but you got to do this for every geography in which you're covering. So keep in mind the language side. Keep in mind how you think about regional branding. Keep in mind how you think about getting and making sure that each of these are up to date, acquiring great geocoding sources for each of these locations, and working globally here. One of the ways that we think about validation. So let's imagine that you've gone through all these steps. You've built what you would consider to be a fairly decent POI file that you're excited about, and you've built the pipelines in order to maintain these things. How do you think about QAing? Other than, all right, I'm going to scroll through a bunch of these lists and figure out, okay, this one doesn't seem right, this one seems right, this one doesn't seem right. We've got a couple of tips and tricks that we generally like to aim at with regards to validation. And here are a couple of very interesting ways that we think about validation. First and foremost, on the transactions data side. So let's imagine that you've got a store location in your POI file that may have been listed as opened last July. You likely shouldn't be seeing transactions at that location prior to July. And if you are, you know that's something that you're going to need to modify, make sure that that metadata is correct. If transactions really didn't start until September of that year, maybe it's time to look and figure out that the open on date for that type of point of interest was a little bit later. With things like foot traffic, in order to validate points of interest, if you're seeing sort of aggregated visits to these types of locations, so aggregated foot traffics on sort of a temporal basis within a given day, if you believe that a location opens at 9 a.m., you probably shouldn't be seeing a significant amount of visits starting at 7 a.m. Right? And if you are, then that can be something that you would flag for yourself or your QA team to go ahead and try to understand that, oh, actually the open hours for this type of location aren't necessarily correct today. Same thing on the closing side, right? If you see a lot of visits happening after 5 p.m. and you've currently got it indexed at 5 p.m. for the closing date, alternatively, you may want to take a look at that. We recommend taking a look at satellite imagery. Of course, this is how most folks compare and look at polygons for these types of places, but a fast overlay between the two, or if you want to get super sophisticated with regards to feature extraction from satellite imagery and do your own comparisons between those features and other sorts of polygons that you've built or derived, would highly recommend using imagery. And then, of course, the AI inputs and human inputs. If you want to throw a couple of interns at running down your lists of metadata, that would be great too. Would highly recommend that. That's also good from a manual tagging perspective, so that then you can funnel that into your whatever models you've got, and understand that these may be correct or incorrect. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about building POIs, the opinionated ways we think about POIs, the types of POIs. Let's talk about how we take those POIs and do a bit of enrichment on top of these. And the way that we think about these things is there are two, and in Emily's conversation just before, there were two very strong inputs that she had mentioned that were used to drive the cannibalization analysis. First being where are folks coming from, and second being store spending at nearby stores. And that's similar to how we think about enriching this type of data as well. We call them patterns and spend. Patterns being aggregated foot traffic data to points of interest, and spend being aggregated consumer spending at points of interest as well. Our opinionated view at these types of schemas within our patterns product, which is, again, the foot traffic side, really focuses around a couple of very interesting pieces. One on the catchment analysis side, catchment area analysis, is understanding origin destination pairs, and broadly, what are the census block groups for those are essentially our small regions in the states. A census block group is about 2,000 homes. What are the of the visitors that are going to a particular location? What neighborhoods do those visitors generally come from? And so over the course of a month, you may have 30 visitors to a particular location, and you see 5 of them are coming from this neighborhood, 10 of them are coming from this neighborhood. Again, all aggregated to a census block group, but this is around understanding this catchment and trade area analysis. But we considered this to be a fairly important input into enrichment that helps drive these types of decisions. Let's imagine that you're working on a project to understand experiential visits to particular store locations. One of the most interesting points of metadata that we find within this type of enrichment is something like dwell time. So, are we driving visitors? Are we driving visitors to stores, and are they staying for the right amount of time? And by right amount of time, are they driving enough value in which they stay for a particular for a good amount of time? And whether those are 5-minute blocks, 10 minutes blocks, 20 minute blocks, those are sort of some of the interesting pieces that we think are fairly strong when it comes to this mobility side with regards to patterns. Of course, there's a myriad of different ways in which we would recommend sort of building this type of product and building this type of insight for your own work. But it all starts with raw mobility data and turning that into what you could consider to be useful contextual insights driven on top of this. So let's imagine you have very raw user timestamp lat long. That's a non-contextual, very challenging order of billions or trillions of rows of data about wayfinding for those types of devices. Being able to take those things, understand the points of interest in which they are actually going to, and using geometry and using sort of the polygons in order to bring these things together. It's a challenging problem, but one in which we find is a good thing to drive the types of inputs that we had talked about. Jumping over, that was sort of the pattern side. So that was, we take those POIs, we enrich with patterns to understand the types of people and the types of ways in which they get there. This also extends to what we would consider to be consumer spending as well. And so this consumer spending, the pieces of metadata on those types of products and those types of insights are things like, are we understanding the types of visitors and the types of buyers at particular locations based off of the correct segmentation for incomes? So for folks who are coming and swiping credit cards or debit cards at a particular location, are we understanding the right types of consumers that are coming to these locations, and are we doing the right things from a marketing and acquisitions perspective in order to drive higher income, more middle income, different types of consumers. We also think that the consumer loyalty is also a fairly strong input into this as well. So as you're thinking about understanding the consumers at a particular location, are you driving enough value for those consumers that they're coming back multiple times per month? And so would recommend probably bucketing those types of consumers into the number of visits that an individual consumer has per month at a particular location. I talked a little bit about the validation and how we think about our patterns product and how we think about building that. When you guys are thinking about building something akin to consumer spending and enriching your points of interest with consumer spending data, one of the ways that we think about validation is with regards to understanding how it correlates to effectively what a company has reported on their quarterly earnings. So if you have the capability to roll these up to a summation and aggregate across an entire brand, this is how one of the ways that we think about validation from a consumer spending perspective. But we found this to be fairly useful for our use cases. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about building POIs. We've talked about understanding the types of POIs, which could be important. We've talked about enriching these types of POIs with different types of consumer behavior. Now let's talk about what the hell we can do with some of this stuff. This is a quote that we've sort of that we've got up on the slide here, but we think that. Of course, working within your own walls and data sets within your own walls is a super meaningful way to drive the right inputs. But in order to truly drive the right outputs, it will require bringing in additional data sets. And I know many of us here, we're all sitting here at SDSC, focusing on all the cool data sets that are available for us to drive these decisions. We think that we're at the early onset. This is a good-sized auditorium. Our expectation is that in the next decade, this auditorium should be about tenfold with regards to the people that are driving value from bringing in external data outside of these things. And so this is why we're fairly excited by this and think that this is such a great ecosystem to work in. Point of interests are great. They help me figure out where locations are. They help me drive consumers to particular locations. They help me drive a certain types of inputs. But it's not the only thing that we need to show, as we saw from Emily's presentation. Right, there were a bunch of inputs into those models, and these use cases extend beyond just the retail competitive intelligence, consumer insights, and site selection side into things like the marketing and advertising space with things like visit attribution, campaign planning. If we've got folks in the ad tech space around location-based advertising, and then in the in the financial services side, things like investment research, risk assessment, economic forecasting. There's a myriad of different inputs for these types of data sets that drive great financial decisions. In the mapping space, let's say you've got a consumer mapping application, or you're driving a mapping application for your enterprise users of certain inputs. Yes, you can just place points of interest on a map and allow people to zoom in, zoom out. But ultimately, having a really great user experience sometimes requires ensuring that the most relevant points of interest are available, and they're the ones that are most viewable at a particular zoom level. And we've seen quite a few interesting use cases around using things like the aggregated spending data at particular locations to best drive what is the location that we show at a particular zoom level, right? If we're really high up, maybe we want to show the ones that have the most number of transactions or the most number of visitors going to those locations. But if I zoom down really narrow, I can show more types of points of interest to my user across these mapping and GIS applications. In what we would consider to be this classification of work called visit attribution, we talked a little bit about how sort of you can build aggregations to drive inputs, but if you're working with your own sort of raw mobility data, being able to deliver the right messaging based off of individualized visits that have happened is a super strong use case that we've seen. This requires not just POIs, but requires your own enrichment work, and one that we think is a fairly important one, especially when it comes to things like personalized messaging and driving consumer behavior. For folks who are working in the marketing side of the house, whether in their own retail organizations or with agencies and alike, campaign planning is fairly important when it comes to not just POIs but the enrichment side as well. Understand that the audiences that you're building are audiences that are important to the types of locations that they're going to, and understand that, hey, the ones that do have the highest loyalty from an end user perspective, those are the ones that we're able to drive the right campaign planning towards at a particular, across a handful of locations. In the real estate side, I can go on and on about the real estate side, but things like asset value optimization, strategic portfolio positioning, these are all great use cases that do require more than just points and more than just points and locations. They do require an understanding for the types of activity, the types of consumer activity that happens at these types of locations, in order to make sure that they're driving the right investment decisions, that they're doing the right excuse me, that they're doing the right underwriting, and that they're doing the right assessment process. We actually had a fairly fun white paper with our friends at Cardo with regards to hotspotting, and that is how can we find the areas and sort of the locations and that drive sort of the most either foot traffic or spend at these locations. These are the types of analyses that are pretty much only available if you're going ahead and enriching beyond just POIs, but fairly strong use cases there. And same thing in our out-of-home work as well that we've done with a handful of partners and customers as well, is let's make sure that we're driving the right ad exposures to folks that are arriving at a particular location from other sorts of census blocks. That's my talk, guys. Thank you so much. We are, from the SafeGraph side, we spend a lot of time with the Carto group, and we're really excited to be here. We're in the data observatory. So if any of this, if you want to beg, borrow, and steal some of the schemas that we've talked about today, as you guys go ahead and build your own POIs and enrichment data, feel free to dive right in. I've got a little bit of Q&A if anybody has questions, but I don't know if anybody does. But thank you very much. We're over at the booth over there. Thank you.